Well, I think today there's a very wide gap between academic economics and sort of what we might call policy economics, particularly in macro. I think if you're maybe a labor economist, maybe the terms that are used in sort of academic studies and the terms that are used in policy debates might be closer to each other. But I think there's a long-standing divide between the sort of questions that academic macroeconomists ask and the sort of questions that come up in policy debates, which has gotten much wider since the crisis. On the unfortunate fact, and people are going to say this is not fair, but I can tell you I've looked at qualifying exams, recent ones from graduate programs in macroeconomics, and this is a fair characterization, what I'm about to say, that the way academic macroeconomics trains people to think is to imagine a representative agent with perfect knowledge of the probabilities of all future events, who is then choosing the best possible outcome for them in terms of maximizing utility over infinite future time under a given set of constraints. That is literally what you are trained to think about if you are an academic, getting an academic training in macroeconomics. I have to say, for people who are not economists watching this, you actually really do have to study this stuff to understand how weird it is. But that's what, and unfortunately that, as far as I can tell, that aspect of the profession has not really changed very much. On the other hand, the public debate on macroeconomic questions has moved a lot over the last decade, so that there's a much wider range of perspectives. If you look at people, in the policy world or in the financial press or even in the business world, so in some ways the public debate has gotten, I think, much better over the past decade, but that's really widened the gap between the public debate and academic macroeconomics. And I think, I don't know how exactly this will come about, but at some point, I think we're really going to have to essentially throw out the existing graduate macroeconomics curriculum and start fresh. Roll back the clock to 1979 or start from somewhere else, because it really does seem like the sort of dominant approach in academic macroeconomics is just an intellectual dead end.
So, I mean, just to pick up on a point which Josh made. So, we have friends who are, I would say, doing a lot of work, as you said, in labor. People like Aaron Dubé at UMass Amherst, which is one of these places which really takes these things seriously, or my colleague Amit Basole where I am at Azim Premji University. And really in some fields, there is sort of back and forth between the world that exists and policy making and really the craft of economics and academic economics. I think it startling to people from outside the discipline to see how far academic economics in macroeconomics has drifted away, if you will, from policy making. And this is why I come back to the Havelmo point, right? I mean, in some sense, the reason for us to be doing many of the things we're doing as academic macroeconomists is to really try to see if we can have an effect on the world, understand the world. And this distinction has become so sharp right now to really make it sort of dysfunctional. Now, the additional problem that comes with it is that because it's hard, it's complex, and it's weird, people spend a lot of time invested in this kind of activity. When I say this activity, it's the activity that Josh was talking about, basically solving equations about some imaginary state. And by the way, that's not only limited to macro, but it's really the worst in macro. And as a result, it becomes very hard for people to pull away from that. And say that there's something really wrong. A sort of an emperor's new clothes moment is extremely painful to face. But it is interesting that one of the advantages, if you will, of studying macroeconomics is there are always people who want to understand what's actually happening in the world. And in some sense, the policy making space, or if I wouldn't say necessarily the policy making space, but what you might call concrete policy macroeconomics has gotten much more open, much more interesting than the past. And you can have a very strong, and I will use the word economic science. You use that only for academic economics, but I think there's an economic science aspect in concrete policy macroeconomics. So I wouldn't want to separate them so sharply as you might have done in the question.
Yeah, and to be fair, there are plenty of prominent mainstream macroeconomists who I think have a lot of interesting and insightful things to say about real economies. The thing is that they just, when they're talking about the real world, they sort of ignore what they do in their scholarly work. They're smart enough and they've got time and energy that they can kind of follow both tracks at once, but they're still two separate tracks. And of course, for most people, that's actually not practical. And if you get sucked into the theory, then you stop thinking about the real questions. And the other thing, just to be fair, is that in the world of empirical macroeconomics, there's more interesting work being done for sure. The problem is that there isn't really a body of theory that the empirical work can link up with.